Welcome to Detective Tales, where mysteries unfold and every detail matters. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, this channel brings you classic-style detective stories filled with suspense, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Here, you'll walk alongside brilliant minds like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, unraveling puzzles where nothing is quite as it seems. Prepare yourself for intrigue, atmosphere, and a journey into the golden age of detective fiction. The case begins now.
Miss Marple and Sir Henry Clithering's final case. Chapter 1. A Retirement Disturbed. The morning sun filtered through the delicate tracery of Miss Marple's cottage garden, casting dappled shadows across the herbaceous borders, where late roses still bloomed with the determined cheerfulness of autumn. Miss Jane Marple, secateurs in hand, was engaged in the pleasant task of dead-heading her prize dahlias, when the sound of purposeful footsteps on the gravel path caused her to look up from her work. The figure approaching her garden gate was unmistakably that of Sir Henry Clithering, though she observed with the quick eye of long practice that something was decidedly amiss with the former Commissioner of Scotland Yard. His usually upright bearing showed a slight stoop, and there was an uncharacteristic hesitancy in his step that spoke of troubled thoughts rather than advancing years. "My dear Sir Henry," Miss Marple called out, setting down her gardening tools and smoothing her apron. "What an unexpected pleasure! Though I must say you look as though you could benefit from a cup of tea and perhaps one of my cook's seed cakes." Sir Henry paused at the gate, his hand resting on the latch as though he were uncertain whether to advance or retreat. The morning light revealed lines of worry etched deeply around his eyes, and Miss Marple noted with concern that his usually immaculate appearance bore signs of distraction. His tie was slightly askew, and there was a tremor in his hands that had nothing to do with age. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice carrying an unusual note of strain, "I hope you will forgive the intrusion. I find myself in rather an awkward position, and I confess that you are the only person I can think of who might provide the counsel I so desperately need." "Nonsense," replied Miss Marple briskly, opening the gate herself, when it became apparent that Sir Henry remained frozen with indecision. "You are always welcome here, as you very well know. Come in, do, and we shall have that tea directly." As they settled in the small sitting room that overlooked the garden, Miss Marple busied herself with the familiar ritual of tea-making, allowing her unexpected guest time to compose himself. She had learned long ago that troubled souls, like shy birds, required patience and gentle encouragement before they would reveal what weighed so heavily upon them. Sir Henry accepted his cup with hands that shook only slightly, though Miss Marple observed that he made no attempt to touch the delicate china cake that accompanied it. Instead, he stared into the amber depths of his tea as though seeking answers in its surface. "I have come to St. Mary Mead," he began at length, seeking peace of mind, though I fear it may prove as elusive here as it has in London. "You see, Miss Marple, I am being haunted. Not by supernatural agencies, I hasten to add, but by something far more disturbing. The past, it seems, is not content to rest quietly." Miss Marple set down her own cup with the careful precision that marked all her movements. "The past," she observed mildly, "has a way of making itself known at the most inconvenient moments, rather like Mrs. Dollop's cat, which appears to be the most docile creature until something disturbs its sleep." "Indeed," Sir Henry said with a rueful smile that did not reach his eyes. "For the past month I had been receiving anonymous letters. Each contains a single newspaper clipping, reports of unsolved murders from my tenure at Scotland Yard. Cases that were never satisfactorily concluded, you understand." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small bundle of envelopes, each bearing his London address in the same precise handwriting. They arrived with clockwork regularity, always on a Tuesday, and each clipping has certain words circled in red ink. The effect is most unsettling. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her keen blue eyes studying her visitor's face with the gentle intensity of a naturalist observing a rare specimen. "And these cases," she inquired delicately, "they span a considerable period?" "From 1923 to 1935, Sir Henry confirmed. 12 years of what someone clearly considers to be failures on my part. The victims were all prominent members of society, a banker, 2 members of Parliament, a judge, people of influence and standing, whose deaths sent ripples through the corridors of power." "How very systematic," Miss Marple murmured. "Rather like old Mrs. Weatherby, who used to send anonymous notes about the state of people's front gardens. She always followed a particular pattern, you know, starting with the house at the end of the lane and working her way systematically toward the village green." Sir Henry looked up sharply. "You think there is a pattern here?" "Oh, my dear Sir Henry, there is always a pattern. The question is whether we are clever enough to discern it." Miss Marple poured more tea, her movements unhurried despite the gravity of the conversation. "You mentioned that you suspect someone wishes to expose what they believe to be corruption in your handling of these cases." The former commissioner's shoulders sagged slightly, as though the weight of unspoken guilt had suddenly become unbearable. There were circumstances surrounding these investigations that were not ideal. Political pressures, you understand, considerations that had little to do with justice and everything to do with maintaining the stability of certain institutions. Miss Marple nodded with the understanding of one who had seen enough of human nature to recognize the compromises that even good men sometimes made. "And now someone wishes to call you to account for those compromises." "So it would seem. Though I confess, Miss Marple, that what disturbs me most is not the potential damage to my reputation. I am, after all, quite retired and beyond the reach of professional consequences. What troubles me is the fear I see in my own reflection each morning, a fear that suggests there may be more at stake here than my past mistakes." Before Miss Marple could respond, the sound of the telephone ringing in the hall interrupted their conversation. She excused herself to answer it, returning moments later with an expression of deep concern. "That was Mr. Petherick at the Blue Boar," she said quietly. "Sir Henry, I believe you mentioned that you had taken rooms there for a few days." "Yes, I thought the peaceful atmosphere of St. Mary Mead might help me think more clearly about this matter." Miss Marple's face was grave as she delivered the news. "I'm afraid, my dear friend, that your peaceful retreat has been somewhat disrupted. You had collapsed in your room and been taken to the cottage hospital. Dr. Haydock is with you now." Sir Henry stared at her in bewilderment. "But that's impossible. I am here with you." "Indeed you are," Miss Marple agreed, "which suggests that someone has gone to considerable trouble to ensure that others believe you are not. Before we continue, I'm your host, Elliot, and welcome to Warm Pages. It's truly beautiful how these stories connect us, no matter where in the world we are. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and if you're enjoying the story so far, feel free to leave a like. It really helps. Now, settle in with your coffee or tea, and let's continue. Chapter 2, The Commissioner's Secret. The cottage hospital wore its usual air of quiet efficiency, though Miss Marple noted with interest that the normally unflappable Nurse Hopkins appeared somewhat flustered as she escorted them down the familiar corridor. The scent of carbolic and lavender water hung in the air, mingling with a more disturbing undertone of something medicinal and unpleasant. Sir Henry lay propped against starched white pillows, his complexion bearing the unmistakable pallor of one who had recently danced rather too close to death's door. Dr. Haydock stood beside the bed, his expression grave as he consulted his notes with the methodical precision that had served him well through 40 years of village practice. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, looking up as she entered. "I thought you might wish to hear this directly. Sir Henry has had rather a close call, I'm afraid. Someone appears to have taken considerable trouble to ensure he would not be continuing his investigation much longer. Miss Marple settled herself in the bedside chair with the careful movements of one who understood that hospitals, like churches, demanded a certain reverence. Poison, I presume? Indeed, a rather sophisticated plant extract, if I'm not mistaken. Difficult to detect and even more difficult to obtain without specialized knowledge. Our patient is fortunate to have a constitution strengthened by years of dealing with London's criminal element. Sir Henry managed a weak smile. I fear my constitution has been tested rather more severely by my conscience than by any criminal doctor. Miss Marple, I owe you an explanation, a complete one this time. He reached toward the bedside table with a trembling hand, withdrawing a folded paper. This was found in my room at the Blue Boar, pinned to my pillow like some medieval challenge. The past never stays buried, Commissioner, it reads. Rather melodramatic, perhaps, but effective in its intent. Miss Marple examined the note with the careful attention she might have given to a particularly interesting specimen in her garden. The paper was of good quality, the handwriting precise and educated. Someone with considerable patience, she observed. This was not written in haste or anger, but with deliberate care. Rather like Mrs. Carmichael when she used to write those letters to the parish council about the state of the churchyard, each word chosen for maximum effect. Sir Henry shifted uncomfortably against his pillows. You are quite right, as always, and I fear the effect has been considerable. Miss Marple, what I am about to tell you must go no further than this room, but I can no longer bear the weight of it alone. He paused, gathering strength not merely for speech, but for the revelation that had clearly tormented him for decades. The anonymous letters relate to a series of murders, for that is what they were, despite the official conclusions, that occurred between 1923 and 1935. 7 deaths in all, each victim a member of an exclusive society that met regularly in Mayfair. The Meridian Society, Miss Marple said quietly, and was rewarded by Sir Henry's startled expression. Oh, my dear friend, when one has lived as long as I have in a village like St. Mary Mead, one learns that secrets have a way of revealing themselves to those who know how to listen. Your society was not as discreet as its members might have believed. Dr. Haydock coughed discreetly. Perhaps I should leave you to your discussion. No, Doctor, please remain, Sir Henry said urgently. What I have to say concerns the safety of us all, I fear. He turned back to Miss Marple, his eyes filled with the weight of long-carried guilt. The Meridian Society was composed of men of considerable influence, politicians, financiers, industrialists. They met ostensibly to discuss matters of mutual interest, but their activities extended far beyond mere conversation. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, recognizing the signs of the man unburdening himself of a secret that had festered too long in darkness. And when the members began to die under suspicious circumstances, I was ordered, Miss Marple, to treat each death as an isolated incident. The pressure came from the highest levels of government. There were considerations of national security, they said. The stability of certain institutions hung in the balance. A former commissioner's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But I knew. God help me, I knew they were connected. The same careful planning, the same attention to detail that made each death appear natural or accidental. Yet I was prevented from pursuing the investigation by men who valued political expediency above justice. Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently smoothing the fabric of her gloves, a gesture Dr. Haydock had learned to recognize as a sign of deep thought. And now, she said at length, someone wishes to call you to account for that compromise. But I suspect, Sir Henry, that the person behind these letters knows far more about the original crimes than any casual observer might. Before Sir Henry could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of Inspector Slack, whose expression bore its customary mixture of determination and barely concealed irritation with anything that threatened to complicate his orderly world. "Sir Henry," he said without preamble, "I've come about the attempt on your life. Poisoned whiskey, delivered to your room with a note claiming it was a gift from Detective Inspector Morrison, your former assistant, I believe." Sir Henry's face went even paler, if such a thing were possible. "Morrison? That's impossible. He would never." "Oh, we don't suspect Morrison himself," Inspector Slack interrupted. "But someone knew enough about your past associations to use his name. The question is, who knew you were staying at the Blue Boar, and who would have access to that particular type of poison?" Miss Marple looked up from her contemplation of the note. "Inspector, I believe you'll find that the answer to both questions lies not in the present, but in the past. Someone with intimate knowledge of Sir Henry's original investigation, someone who has been planning this confrontation for a very long time." As if summoned by her words, a figure appeared in the doorway. An elderly gentleman of distinguished appearance, well dressed, but bearing an air of watchful concern. He hesitated upon seeing the assembled group, as though debating whether to advance or retreat. "I beg your pardon," he said with old-fashioned courtesy. "I was looking for Sir Henry Clithering. I heard he had been taken ill." Miss Marple studied the newcomer with interest, noting the quality of his clothes, the careful way he held himself, and most particularly the flash of recognition, quickly suppressed, that had crossed Sir Henry's features at the sound of his voice. Chapter 3. Whispers from Scotland Yard. The police station at St. Mary Mead had not been designed to accommodate investigations of such gravity, and Inspector Slack's cramped office bore testimony to this fact, as manila folders spilled across every available surface like autumn leaves after a particularly vigorous storm. Miss Marple occupied the single visitor's chair with her customary composure, while Sir Henry, somewhat restored after his ordeal, but still bearing the pallor of recent illness, perched uncomfortably on a hard wooden stool borrowed from the constable's desk. The case files had arrived from Scotland Yard with impressive efficiency, though Miss Marple observed that their very presence seemed to cast a shadow over the proceedings that had little to do with the grey October light filtering through the station's modest windows. 7 deaths, Inspector Slack announced, with the satisfaction of the man who appreciated numerical precision. "All members of this Meridian Society of yours, Sir Henry, though I must say, the official conclusions make for rather curious reading." Miss Marple accepted the first file with the careful attention she might have devoted to a particularly intricate piece of needlework. A photograph paperclip to the inside cover showed a distinguished gentleman in his 50s, with the kind of assured expression that spoke of a life lived in comfortable certainty of one's place in the world. "Mr. Reginald Fortescue," she read aloud, "banker and philanthropist. Found dead in his library on the evening of March 15th, 1923. Apparent heart failure, though the family physician noted certain irregularities in the post-mortem examination that were never satisfactorily explained." Sir Henry shifted uncomfortably on his makeshift seat. Fortescue had received a rather curious gift that afternoon, a bottle of his favourite brandy, delivered with a card expressing admiration for his recent charitable work. The brandy was found to be perfectly harmless, yet something about the timing struck me as peculiar even then. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, turning to the next file. "Rather like the flowers that were left on old Mrs. Trent's doorstep every Tuesday for a month before she died. Perfectly innocent gestures, yet there was something in their very innocence that seemed calculated to disturb." The second file revealed the photograph of a stern-faced gentleman with the unmistakable bearing of political authority. "Sir Marcus Whitfield, Member of Parliament," Inspector Slack read over her shoulder. "Died in a carriage accident in Hyde Park, though the horse was found to be perfectly sound and the weather conditions ideal. Most peculiar." Miss Marple studied the details with the methodical care that had served her well in countless village mysteries. Each death carefully staged to appear natural or accidental, yet following a pattern that becomes clear only when viewed as a whole. Rather like Mrs. Dollop's method of dealing with mice in her pantry, each trap set with infinite patience, each success building toward a larger design. The files continued to reveal their secrets with mounting unease. A judge found dead in his chambers, apparently of apoplexy, though he had been in perfect health the previous day. A newspaper publisher who suffered a fatal fall down his own staircase, despite being intimately familiar with every step. An industrialist who choked on a fishbone at his club, though the waiter swore the fish had been properly filleted. The pattern becomes unmistakable, Sir Henry admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of long-suppressed knowledge. Each victim had received some form of contact in the days preceding their death. A gift, a message, a seemingly innocent social call. Yet at the time, the political pressure to treat each case separately was overwhelming. Miss Marple set down the final file with the deliberate care of one handling something both precious and dangerous. And the seventh victim? Never found, Inspector Slack replied grimly. Reginald Ashford, secretary to the Meridian Society, disappeared without trace in December 1935. His rooms were found undisturbed, his affairs in perfect order, yet he vanished as completely as morning mist. Before anyone could respond, the sound of measured footsteps in the corridor announced an arrival that caused Sir Henry to straighten with visible relief. Detective Inspector Morrison, now some years into retirement but retaining the upright bearing that marked him as a career policeman, appeared in the doorway with an expression of grave concern. "Sir Henry," he said without preamble, "I received your message and came as quickly as I could. This business of the anonymous letters, I fear it may be even more serious than you imagined." Miss Marple studied the newcomer with interest, noting the quality of his attention to detail as he surveyed the cluttered office, the way his eyes lingered on each face present, cataloguing and assessing with professional thoroughness. Morrison reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a bundle of letters that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to those that had so disturbed Sir Henry. "I, too, have been receiving correspondence," he said quietly, "but mine contains something rather more disturbing than newspaper clippings." He selected the topmost envelope and extracted its contents, several sheets of official letterhead, bearing the distinctive crest of Scotland Yard. "Internal memoranda from the original investigation," he explained, his voice tight with controlled concern. "Documents that were classified at the highest level and supposedly destroyed decades ago." Miss Marple accepted the papers with hands steady despite the magnitude of their implications. The first memorandum, dated April 1924, and marked "Most Secret," detailed concerns about the political ramifications of pursuing the Meridian Society investigation. The language was cautious, bureaucratic, yet the underlying message was unmistakable. Certain avenues of inquiry were to be discouraged in the interests of national stability. "Most illuminating," she observed, her tone suggesting she found the revelation neither surprising nor particularly shocking. "Though I suspect these memoranda represent only the tip of the proverbial iceberg. Someone with access to the most confidential aspects of your investigation has chosen to remind you both of the compromises that were made." Sir Henry leaned forward, his face drawn with anxiety. That who could possibly have such access? The files were classified, the investigation team sworn to secrecy. Morrison's expression grew even more troubled. "There is something else," he said reluctantly. "The memoranda make reference to a witness who was never officially interviewed, someone identified only as the secretary, who apparently had intimate knowledge of the Society's private meetings and financial arrangements." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. A secretary who chose to remain in the shadows rather than come forward with evidence that might have prevented further deaths. Or, suggested Inspector Slack, with the blunt practicality that characterized his approach to criminal matters, a secretary who had very good reasons for maintaining that silence, perhaps because he was rather more involved in these deaths than anyone suspected at the time. The implications of this observation settled over the assembled group like a chill autumn fog, bringing with it the uncomfortable realization that their investigation had suddenly taken a far more dangerous turn than any of them had anticipated. Chapter 4. The Village Connection. The morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn, as Miss Marple made her purposeful way along the high street, her shopping basket swinging gently at her side in a manner that suggested errands of the most mundane nature. Yet those familiar with her methods might have observed that her route took her past the village records office with the kind of calculated precision that marked her more serious investigations. Mrs. Pemble, the records keeper, greeted her with the enthusiasm reserved for those rare souls who show genuine interest in the dustier corners of local history. The small office, with its towering shelves of leather-bound volumes and the perpetual scent of old paper and binding glue, had always held a particular fascination for Miss Marple, rather like a garden where the most interesting specimens grew in the least expected corners. "I find myself curious about property transactions," Miss Marple explained, with the gentle diffidence that invariably encouraged cooperation, particularly those from the late 1930s. There's something so revealing about the patterns of human settlement, don't you think? Rather like studying the migration habits of birds. Mrs. Pemble, whose passion for local records was matched only by her appreciation for someone who shared her enthusiasm, required little encouragement to produce the relevant volumes. The property records for 1936 to 1939 revealed several interesting anomalies. Purchases made by individuals whose names appeared nowhere in earlier local documentation, as though they had materialized from the ether with the singular purpose of acquiring English countryside retreats. "Most curious," Miss Marple murmured, running her finger down a column of entries. "Mr. R. Ashworth, purchaser of Ashford Cottage in February 1936. Such a substantial property for someone with no previous connection to the village." Mrs. Pemble peered over her spectacles with the conspiratorial air of one sharing a particularly choice piece of gossip. "Oh, that cottage has quite a history, Miss Marple. Changed hands several times over the years, though it's been quiet enough since Mr. Thornton took residence about 5 years past. Keeps very much to himself, though I understand he's made quite a garden of the place." The name Ashworth resonated in Miss Marple's mind with the clarity of a church bell on a still morning. The similarity to Ashford, the missing secretary of the Meridian Society, struck her as being rather too convenient to be mere coincidence. In her experience, coincidences in matters of murder were about as common as honest testimonials from servant girls seeking new positions. Armed with this intelligence, Miss Marple set about arranging a visit to the cottage under circumstances that would appear entirely natural. Her reputation as a knowledgeable gardener provided the perfect entree, and within the hour she found herself walking up the well-tended path to Ashford Cottage, ostensibly seeking advice about the cultivation of hybrid tea roses. Mr. Thornton proved to be a gentleman of distinguished appearance, though Miss Marple's practised eye noted certain details that spoke of a past rather more complex than his current circumstances might suggest. His clothes, while perfectly suitable for a retired gentleman of modest means, bore the unmistakable hallmarks of Savile Row tailoring from a bygone era. The hands that gestured as he spoke were soft and well cared for, yet bore the faint calluses that suggested recent acquaintance with manual labor. "How delightful to meet a fellow enthusiast," he said, ushering her into a sitting room that commanded an excellent view of the village green. "I confess that gardening has become something of a passion in my retirement years. There's something deeply satisfying about nurturing life from the soil, don't you find?" Miss Marple accepted the offered tea with her customary grace, though her attention was divided between her host's pleasant conversation and the various objects that furnished his modest dwelling. The furniture was of excellent quality, pieces that would not have looked out of place in a London club or a gentleman's study in Mayfair. Yet there was something studied about their arrangement, as though they had been carefully selected to create a particular impression rather than accumulated through the natural processes of a lifetime's residence. "I understand the cottage has quite a history," she ventured, settling back in her chair with a comfortable air of one prepared for a lengthy chat. Mrs. Pemble at the records office mentioned that it had several previous owners. A slight stiffening of Mr. Thornton's shoulders was the only indication that the topic caused him any discomfort. "Indeed, though I confess I know little of its earlier inhabitants. I purchased it from an estate agent in Much Benham, sight unseen, as it were. The photographs were most appealing, and the price quite reasonable." Miss Marple's gaze wandered to a photograph displayed on the mantelpiece, a formal group portrait of several gentlemen in evening dress, their faces bearing the confident expressions of men accustomed to deference and respect. One face had been carefully excised from the group, leaving only a precise rectangular gap where a figure had once stood. "What an interesting photograph," she observed mildly. "Rather reminds me of the portraits we used to have at the church committee meetings, though ours were never quite so formal." Mr. Thornton followed her gaze with barely concealed agitation. "A memento of my government service days," he explained quickly. "Rather tedious, really. Ceremonial functions and the like. I fear I can barely remember the circumstances under which it was taken." The conversation continued pleasantly enough, touching on roses and rainfall, the merits of various fertilizing techniques, and the challenges of maintaining a garden in advancing years. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly intrigued by the subtle contradictions in her host's presentation of himself. His knowledge of horticulture, while adequate, lacked the deep familiarity that comes from years of practical experience. His references to government service were vague to the point of evasiveness, and there was something in his manner, a watchfulness, a careful measuring of words, that suggested a man long accustomed to concealing his true thoughts. As she prepared to take her leave, Miss Marple's attention was caught by a bookshelf that occupied one corner of the sitting room. Among the expected volumes of poetry and popular fiction were several works on toxicology and botanical chemistry, subjects that struck her as rather specialized interests for a gentleman primarily concerned with rose cultivation. "How fascinating," she remarked, approaching the shelf with genuine curiosity. "I see you have quite a collection on plant chemistry. Rather advanced reading for amateur gardening, I should have thought." Mr. Thornton moved quickly to position himself between Miss Marple and the bookshelf, his manner suddenly tense. "A hobby of sorts," he said stiffly. "I find the scientific aspects of horticulture quite engaging. Understanding the chemical processes involved in plant growth and protection." Miss Marple nodded with apparent understanding, though she filed away this reaction along with the other small anomalies she had observed. As she walked back toward the village, she was acutely aware of being watched from the cottage windows, and she turned once to offer a cheerful wave, rewarded by the hasty withdrawal of a figure from behind the lace curtains. That evening, as she sat in her own garden watching the last light fade from the October sky, Miss Marple reflected on the curious contradictions presented by Mr. Thornton and his cottage. The man who claimed to know nothing of the property's history yet lived surrounded by furnishings that spoke of wealth and position. The retired government servant whose service remained mysteriously undefined. The amateur gardener whose library contained works that would challenge a professional chemist. Chapter 5. Patterns from the Past. The drawing room at Miss Marple's cottage had taken on the aspect of a campaign headquarters, with documents spread across the mahogany table in careful order, each file positioned with the methodical precision that marked her approach to the most serious matters. Sir Henry, now sufficiently recovered to venture out despite Dr. Haydock's stern admonitions about the fragility of his constitution, occupied his customary chair by the window, though Miss Marple observed that his attention remained fixed upon the papers before them, with an intensity that spoke of more than mere professional interest. "The pattern becomes clearer when one views it from the proper perspective," Miss Marple observed, adjusting her spectacles as she examined the chronological arrangement of the Meridian Society deaths. "Rather like Mrs. Weatherby's prize-winning quilts, each individual square appears unremarkable, yet when assembled according to the maker's design, they reveal a harmony of purpose that transforms the ordinary into something quite extraordinary." Sir Henry traced his finger along the timeline they had constructed, his expression growing increasingly troubled as the implications became manifest. "Reginald Ashford occupied a unique position within the society," he admitted reluctantly. "As secretary, he maintained all correspondence, prepared meeting minutes, and handled the financial arrangements for their various enterprises. He possessed intimate knowledge of every member's business dealings, personal habits, and social connections." Miss Marple nodded with the satisfaction of one whose suspicions had been confirmed by methodical investigation. "Precisely the sort of information that would enable someone to approach each victim in the manner most likely to disarm their natural caution. A banker might welcome a gift of fine brandy from an admiring client, while a member of Parliament would think nothing of accepting congratulations on a recent speech." The October afternoon light cast long shadows across the scattered documents, lending an appropriately sombre atmosphere to their deliberations. Miss Marple had arranged the evidence with characteristic thoroughness, the original case files, Morrison's classified memoranda, and her own carefully compiled notes on the mysterious Mr. Thornton, whose cottage bore such an intriguing resemblance to the name of the missing secretary. "The methodology demonstrates considerable sophistication," Sir Henry continued, his voice heavy with the weight of professional regret. "Each death was crafted to exploit the victim's particular vulnerabilities while maintaining the appearance of natural causes. The judge who suffered apoplexy had been working excessively long hours on a controversial case. The industrialist who choked at his club had a well-known habit of eating too quickly when preoccupied with business matters." Miss Marple set down her teacup with the deliberate care that preceded her most significant observations. "Yet the murders ceased abruptly in December 1935, not because the perpetrator was apprehended, but because there were no more targets remaining. 7 members of the Meridian Society, 7 carefully planned deaths, and then silence." "Until now," Sir Henry added grimly. "The anonymous letters suggest that our mysterious correspondent considers the work unfinished, but who remains to be targeted after all these years." Before Miss Marple could respond, the sound of measured footsteps on the garden path announced the arrival of Detective Inspector Morrison, whose appearance bore the unmistakable signs of a man who had spent considerable time in urgent consultation with his former colleagues. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of hasty travel, and there was an urgency in his manner that spoke of developments requiring immediate attention. "Sir Henry, Miss Marple," he said without preamble as he was shown into the drawing-room, "I've just returned from London, where I've been reviewing the original investigation files with some of our retired colleagues. What I've discovered is most disturbing." He accepted Miss Marple's offer of refreshment with the distracted air of one whose thoughts were fully occupied with weightier matters. "The Meridian Society's activities extended far beyond what we originally suspected. They were involved in arms dealing, insider trading, and political manipulation on an international scale. The 7 victims were not merely wealthy gentlemen with questionable business practices. They were active participants in enterprises that contributed to considerable suffering and loss of life." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the calm acceptance of one who had long since ceased to be surprised by the capacity of seemingly respectable individuals for moral compromise, which would provide our mysterious secretary with what he might consider justification for his actions, rather like young Tommy Fletcher, who appointed himself the village's guardian of moral standards and took to leaving anonymous notes about various indiscretions. The boy genuinely believed he was serving the cause of justice, though his methods were decidedly questionable. Sir Henry leaned forward with renewed intensity. But if Ashford, assuming our Mr. Thornton is indeed the missing secretary, has already eliminated all the society members, why resume his campaign now? What could possibly motivate him to risk exposure after so many years of successful concealment? Morrison reached into his briefcase and withdrew a newspaper clipping, its edges yellowed with age, but its significance unmistakable. This appeared in last month's Times Literary Supplement, a review of your recently published memoirs, Sir Henry. The reviewer made particular mention of your chapter dealing with unsolved cases, including a brief reference to the Meridian Society investigation. The implications struck Miss Marple with the clarity of morning light breaking through winter fog. Of course, Mr. Ashford has spent decades believing his work was complete, his victims forgotten, their crimes buried with them. Then suddenly he discovers that someone who came dangerously close to exposing him, has chosen to resurrect the case in published form. Precisely, Morrison confirmed. From Ashford's perspective, your memoirs represent a threat to the carefully constructed new life he has built in St. Mary Mead. Worse, they suggest that the investigation might be renewed, that new eyes might examine evidence he believed safely buried. Sir Henry's face had grown increasingly pale as the significance of their deductions became clear. Then, the anonymous letters were not merely attempts at intimidation, they were warnings. Ashford was providing me with evidence that could be used to expose the Society's crimes posthumously, while simultaneously demonstrating that he possessed the knowledge and means to ensure my silence permanently. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the window, her gaze directed toward the village green where the ordinary activities of rural life continued with their customary tranquillity. Yet beneath that peaceful surface, she reflected, human nature pursued its eternal patterns of ambition, revenge, and moral compromise with the same relentless determination that had driven civilization since time immemorial. The question that remains, she said quietly, is whether Mr. Ashford, or Mr. Thornton, as he now styles himself, has truly completed his work, or whether he considers there to be one final account that requires settling. Chapter 6, A Deadly Reunion. The drawing-room at Gossington Hall possessed the kind of understated elegance that spoke of generations of careful stewardship, its chintz-covered chairs and polished mahogany surfaces, providing the perfect setting for what Miss Marple privately considered to be the final act of a drama that had been unfolding for more than 2 decades. Mrs. Bantry, with her characteristic generosity, had readily agreed to host what Miss Marple had described as a small gathering to discuss local historical matters, though both ladies understood that the true purpose of the evening would be considerably more grave than such innocent terminology might suggest. The assembled company presented a study in contrasts, each participant carrying with them the weight of secrets that would soon be laid bare beneath the gentle illumination of the standard lamps and the flickering warmth of the coal fire. Sir Henry occupied his chair with the careful posture of a man still recovering from his recent ordeal, while Detective Inspector Morrison maintained the alert bearing that marked him as a career policeman even in retirement. Inspector Slack had positioned himself near the door with the strategic awareness of one prepared for any eventuality, and Dr. Haydock completed the group with his usual air of professional competence tempered by obvious curiosity about the proceedings. Mr. Thornton, for Miss Marple had decided to maintain the fiction of his assumed identity until the proper moment, arrived precisely at the appointed hour, his appearance that of a gentleman caller, attending a social engagement of modest importance. Yet Miss Marple's trained eye detected the subtle signs of nervous tension in the careful way he surveyed the assembled company, the slight tremor in his hands as he accepted Mrs. Bantry's offer of sherry, and the manner in which his gaze lingered on Sir Henry with an intensity that spoke of emotions far deeper than casual social interest. "How delightful to see so many distinguished gentlemen gathered in one place," Miss Marple observed with the gentle enthusiasm that characterized her approach to social occasions. "It quite reminds me of the meetings we used to hold for the Church Restoration Fund, though I suspect our discussions this evening may prove rather more illuminating than debates about roof tiles and heating systems." The conversation began with the kind of polite generalities that mark the opening phases of any social gathering, touching upon the weather, the state of the gardens, and various matters of local interest. Yet Miss Marple observed that Mr. Thornton's participation remained carefully measured, his responses designed to deflect attention rather than encourage further inquiry, much like Mrs. Weatherby's nephew, who had once attended parish meetings while maintaining an elaborate fiction about his supposed military service in India. "I understand you have some expertise in local history, Mr. Thornton," Miss Marple ventured, as the conversation turned toward the village's past. "Perhaps you might share your thoughts on the changes that have occurred in St. Mary Mead over the past several decades." Mr. Thornton's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on his sherry glass, though his voice remained admirably steady as he replied, "I fear my knowledge is rather limited, Miss Marple. My residence here has been relatively brief, and I've concentrated more on establishing my garden than on studying the community's historical development." Detective Inspector Morrison, who had been observing the proceedings with the professional interest of one long accustomed to reading human nature under stress, chose this moment to introduce a more pointed element to their discussion. "It's curious how the past has a way of intruding upon the present," he remarked casually, reaching into his coat pocket to withdraw a familiar-looking photograph. "I was reviewing some old case files recently and came across this rather interesting group portrait." The photograph, the same formal gathering of gentlemen in evening dress that Miss Marple had observed on Mr. Thornton's mantelpiece, was passed around the assembled company with the careful attention accorded to evidence of particular significance. When it reached Mr. Thornton, Miss Marple noted with interest that his composure finally showed signs of strain, his face growing pale as recognition dawned with the inevitability of sunrise. "The Meridian Society," Sir Henry said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of long-suppressed memory. "Their final formal gathering, December 1935. 7 gentlemen who wielded considerable influence in the corridors of power, all of whom would be dead within a month, save one." Mr. Thornton set down his sherry glass with movements that had suddenly become mechanical, his earlier pretense of casual interest replaced by the watchful stillness of a cornered animal. "I'm afraid I don't understand the significance of this photograph," he said, though the tremor in his voice suggested otherwise. Morrison leaned forward, with the deliberate patience of a man prepared to pursue his quarry to the inevitable conclusion. "Oh, I think you understand perfectly well, Mr. Ashford. Or should I say, Mr. Reginald Ashford, former secretary to the Meridian Society and one of the most methodical killers in the annals of Scotland Yard." The silence that followed this revelation possessed the quality of held breath, as though the very atmosphere of the drawing-room had been suspended, pending some momentous disclosure. Mr. Thornton, or Ashford, as his true identity now stood revealed, remained motionless for several heartbeats, before his shoulders sagged with the relief of one who had carried a burden too long in solitude. "You are quite correct, Inspector Morrison," he said, with quiet dignity, his assumed persona falling away like a discarded theatrical costume. "I am indeed Reginald Ashford, though I confess I had hoped that particular identity had been buried beyond resurrection." Miss Marple observed this transformation with the satisfaction of one whose patient investigation had yielded the anticipated results. "Rather like Mrs. Dollop's prize roses," she murmured approvingly. "They appear quite ordinary until the proper conditions reveal their true nature." Ashford turned to face Sir Henry with an expression that mingled regret with something approaching defiance. "I suppose you deserve an explanation, Commissioner, though I doubt you will find it particularly comforting. The Meridian Society was responsible for far more suffering than your official investigation ever revealed. Their arms dealing prolonged conflicts that cost thousands of lives. Their financial manipulations destroyed countless families, and their political corruption undermined the very institutions they were sworn to serve." Sir Henry nodded with a heavy acceptance of one confronting truths long suspected but carefully avoided. "And, when the authorities failed to act, you took matters into your own hands." "I discovered their true activities gradually," Ashford continued, his voice gaining strength as he unburdened himself of decades of secrecy. "As secretary, I was privy to correspondence that revealed the full extent of their crimes. When I attempted to expose them through proper channels, I was informed that considerations of national security made prosecution impossible. They were too valuable, too well connected, too dangerous to challenge directly." Inspector Slack, who had been listening with the focused attention of a professional evaluating evidence, moved slightly closer to his position near the door. "So, you decided to become judge, jury, and executioner." Ashford's smile held no warmth, only the cold satisfaction of a man who had pursued his chosen course to its logical conclusion. "I became what they forced me to become, Inspector. Each death was carefully planned to exploit their individual weaknesses: the banker's love of fine spirits, the judge's tendency toward overwork, the industrialist's habit of eating too quickly when preoccupied with business matters." Chapter 7. The Truth in Plain Sight. The drawing room at Gossington Hall had assumed the hushed quality of a courtroom awaiting verdict, though the only sound to disturb the weighted silence was the gentle tick of the mantel clock and the occasional settling of coals in the grate. Ashford's confession hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, its acrid truth permeating the comfortable atmosphere that Mrs. Bantry had so carefully cultivated for her guests. Miss Marple observed the assembled company with the careful attention of a naturalist studying specimens under particular stress, noting how each individual processed the revelation according to their own nature and experience. Sir Henry bore the expression of a man confronting the consequences of choices made decades past, while Morrison maintained the alert stillness of a professional prepared for any development. Inspector Slack had moved imperceptibly closer to Ashford's chair, his hand resting with deceptive casualness near his coat pocket. Bells marked the hours with their customary precision. Yet beneath this surface tranquillity, Miss Marple reflected, the events of recent weeks had set in motion currents that would continue to influence lives and reputations for years to come, rather like the underground springs that fed her own garden well. Truth once revealed had a way of finding new channels through which to flow, often with consequences that extended far beyond their original source. The sound of measured footsteps on the garden path drew her attention to the approaching figure of Sir Henry Clithering, whose appearance showed the unmistakable signs of a man who had found a measure of peace after decades of troubled conscience. His bearing had regained much of its former uprightness, and there was a purposefulness in his stride that spoke of resolved determination rather than the hesitant uncertainty that had marked his earlier visits. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, upon being admitted to her sitting room, "I come bearing news that I believe will interest you considerably. Mr. Ashford has made a most remarkable recovery, though Dr. Haydock assures me that his condition remains quite serious. More importantly, he has agreed to provide full cooperation with the authorities in exchange for considerations regarding his sentence." Miss Marple settled into her customary chair with the composed attention of one prepared to receive intelligence of the utmost significance. "How gratifying to learn that his conscience has proven stronger than his instinct for self-preservation, though I confess I am not entirely surprised. Even in his deception, there were signs of a man who had retained some measure of moral feeling. Sir Henry accepted the offered tea with obvious gratitude, his manner suggesting that the beverage provided comfort beyond its mere physical warmth. The documentation discovered in his cottage has proved quite extraordinary, Miss Marple. Ashford maintained meticulous records of the Meridian Society's activities, correspondence, financial records, meeting minutes that detail transactions involving arms sales, political manipulation, and financial fraud on a scale that extends far beyond our original investigation. The implications of this revelation struck Miss Marple with the clarity of morning light illuminating a previously shadowed corner. Then, his years in St. Mary Mead were spent not merely in hiding, but in preserving evidence that he hoped would eventually serve the cause of justice, even if he himself could not live to see it properly applied. Precisely so, Sir Henry confirmed. The authorities have already begun reopening several cases from the period, and there is every indication that Ashford's documentation will lead to a complete reassessment of the Meridian Society's influence on government policy during the interwar years. Justice delayed, perhaps, but justice nonetheless. Miss Marple reflected upon the curious irony of a situation in which a man's criminal activities had ultimately served to preserve evidence of far greater crimes. Rather like old Mr. Carmody's habit of hoarding newspapers, she observed thoughtfully. The family considered it an embarrassing eccentricity until his collection proved invaluable in settling a property dispute that had troubled the village for decades. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Detective Inspector Morrison, whose appearance bore the satisfied expression of a professional who had seen a complex case reach its proper conclusion. He carried with him a briefcase that, Miss Marple suspected, contained documents of considerable importance to their ongoing discussion. "Sir Henry, Miss Marple," he said with evident pleasure, "I bring news that will complete our understanding of this remarkable affair. Ashford has provided detailed confessions regarding not only the 7 Meridian Society murders, but also 3 additional deaths that occurred during the same period, cases that were never connected to the Society but were, it appears, part of his broader campaign of retribution." Miss Marple absorbed this information with a calm acceptance of one who had long since learned that human capacity for both good and evil often exceeded even the most pessimistic expectations. 10 deaths in total, then, a most thorough accounting of what he considered his moral obligations. Morrison nodded grimly. Yet perhaps most significantly, his cooperation has revealed the existence of a network of corruption that extended far beyond the original society. Associates, facilitators, and beneficiaries whose activities contributed to the very crimes that motivated Ashford's vigilante campaign. The investigation has taken on dimensions that none of us anticipated. Sir Henry leaned forward with renewed interest. "And the prospects for prosecution?" "Quite promising, despite the passage of time," Morrison replied. "Several of the individuals identified in Ashford's documentation are still living, and that crimes fall within jurisdictions where the statute of limitations does not apply. More importantly, the evidence has already been shared with international authorities investigating similar networks in other countries." Miss Marple considered the broader implications of these developments with the philosophical detachment that marked her approach to matters of justice and human nature. Then Mr. Ashford's misguided quest for personal vengeance has inadvertently served the cause of legitimate justice in ways he could never have anticipated. Though one cannot help but wonder whether the same results might have been achieved through more conventional means, had the will existed to pursue them at the proper time. The observation carried within it an implicit criticism of the institutional failures that had created the circumstances leading to Ashford's transformation from idealistic secretary to methodical killer, a criticism that Sir Henry acknowledged with visible discomfort. "You raise a point that has troubled my conscience considerably, Miss Marple," he admitted. "The political pressures that prevented proper investigation of the Meridian Society's activities must bear some responsibility for the tragedies that followed. Had we been permitted to pursue justice through legitimate channels, those 10 lives might have been spared." Morrison, who had been examining some papers from his briefcase, looked up with an expression of professional interest mixed with personal satisfaction. "There is one final development that may provide some measure of consolation, Sir Henry. Ashford has requested that his estate, which proves to be considerably more substantial than his modest lifestyle would suggest, be donated to a foundation supporting victims of organized crime and corruption. His solicitor informs me that the bequest will fund investigations and prosecutions for decades to come." Miss Marple smiled with the gentle approval she reserved for those rare occasions when human nature demonstrated its capacity for redemption despite the most unpromising circumstances. "How very appropriate. Rather like Mrs. Weatherby's decision to leave her prize rose garden to the village, ensuring that beauty would continue to flourish long after the gardener herself had departed." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across her cottage garden, Miss Marple reflected upon the complex legacy of Reginald Ashford's extraordinary life. His methods had been inexcusable, his victims numerous, and his deception prolonged and elaborate. Yet his ultimate contribution to the cause of justice would likely exceed that of many who had pursued more conventional paths to moral satisfaction.